Welcome, everyone, to the Fantasy and Betting Podcast presented by the 33rd Team. I am your host, as always, Josh Larky, joined, as always, by my co-host, Ryan Reynolds. Today, we're going to recap some Week 3 NFL action and start to look a little bit ahead to Week 4. Thursday Night Football for Week 4. It's a nice divisional matchup, Packers-Lions. Lions are favored by 1 point. Game total's pretty hefty already at 45. If we look at Green Bay, Jordan Love, I talked about it last week. Probably too much, but apparently not enough, because all I talked about was how he was going to come back down to earth with some of his passing efficiency. Back-to-back weeks of 3 touchdowns, no interceptions. He finishes Week 3 with 1 touchdown pass and 1 interception. The fantasy points were there. He ran 9 times for 39 yards and a touchdown. Good for him. He also threw 517 air yards, most in the NFL this past week, but he still averaged under 6 yards per attempt. Did he look fine in Week 3? Obviously, the touchdown numbers came back to earth, but how did he look in comeback mode for much of that game?
I think fine's the right word. Nothing like to get real happy about, but we'll also give him this caveat here is Green Bay's skill position group's been pretty banged up the whole season. So he's playing well with a lower supporting cast than he will when they're at full strength.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how Romeo Doubs and Jaden Reed, how their routes end up when Christian Watson returns, which he probably will in Week 4. They've both feasted through 3 weeks. They're each averaging about 7 targets per game. At least one of them, if not both, will take a significant hit. I'm inclined to think that Reed takes the immediate hit. Romeo Doubs takes the hit longer term for the rest of the season. Anything else to add on the Packers before we turn to their Lions opponent?
I mean, 2 things really. The defense, we talked about this in the offseason. They have a very talented defense. The defense has played very well through the first 3 weeks. And the other thing, you got to give Love credit here. They were down 17-0 when Derek Carr went out. They came back. Jameis Winston helped them a little bit, but they came back and won. So you got to give them some credit there.
Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds, NFL, on Twitter. Looking at the Lions, Jahmyr Gibbs handled 17 of the 25 running back carries in David Montgomery's absence. All 4 red zone carries went to him. He only ran a route, though, on 50% of Jared Goff's dropbacks. That was significantly down from Week 2. He caught 1 of 2 targets for 2 yards. We talked about this morning. Jahmyr Gibbs, classic case of optimal usage for him not really lining up with how he was actually used. I don't know why you would run the 195 pounder through the tackles, between the tackles, like 15 times in that game. It really makes no sense. I'd say the bright spot, though, was the usage of Sam Laporta. His target shares through 3 weeks were 16%, 18%, 36%. The fantasy points were 9, then 11, and then 22 this past week. I think he's a top 6 fantasy tight end option rest of season. The only 4 guys that I think look obviously better would be Travis Kelce, TJ Hawkinson. Still going to give the benefit of the doubt to Mark Andrews. And then I'm going to give a half point to Darren Waller and a half point to George Kittle. Laporta is right in the mix here for fantasy tight end options. What did you see out of the Lions in a game where they just absolutely handled the Falcons in Week 3?
Detroit's a good football team. They've played 2 very good games on defense on opening day against the Chiefs and now this week against the Falcons. Offense was good in Week 2 against Seattle, but, as we saw this week, they've had some injuries. The usage pool is very narrow. Amon-Ra, Laporta, Gibbs. It's going to be very interesting to see how this team shapes out when Jameson Williams comes back and when David Montgomery returns from injury.
The next game to begin the Sunday slate would be the Jaguars and Falcons. Jaguars favored by just 3 points. Very disappointing loss this past weekend to the Texans. Game total is 44 for this one. When we look at Jacksonville, back-to-back weeks now that Dearness Johnson's out-touched Tank Bigsby. Tank Bigsby got the lone goal line carry. He did score. Ultimately, you might be like, why are you telling me this? Well, folks, it makes me actually less interested in both Dearness Johnson and Tank Bigsby, where the last thing that you want is, obviously you don't want ETN to go down, but if he does go down, I really don't know how this usage shakes out. It doesn't look like there really is a direct backup. And for fantasy, we usually want to invest in situations where we know, like, should Najee Harris go down, Jaylen Warren gets most of the touches. And this is a case where I think it's truly a gamble as to who would step in as the RB2. And then my other question, Ryan, this one, kicking it to you. I think this is the preseason division favorite I might be most concerned about through 3 games. What have you seen out of this Jaguars team?
That's a good question, Josh. I'm going to talk about everything here for the Jaguars real quick. A big thing that I take into account every week is undervalued versus overvalued. And you look at this Jaguars team like, oh my God, they got blown out by the Texans at home. Well, that's true. I'm going to give you a few little details here that kind of made this an outlier type performance. 30-yard touchdown drop from Ridley on the first drive. Jacksonville ended up scoring no points in that drive. They had a blocked field goal in this game. The Texans returned a bobbled kick for a touchdown. There was a diving interception by a linebacker in this game. The early score of this contest could have been 14-10 Houston. Instead, it was 14-0 Houston, which changed the complexion of this game a little bit. I'm a little concerned for sure because, again, 34-17 against the Texans is not good. But like I said, outlier contest. I'm not in panic mode yet. And especially since Jacksonville's going to England next week to play like a borderline home game since they've been there so often, I'll wait to freak out until next week.
All right, guys, we have one more week. When we look at the Falcons, I think one thing I learned from last week, the Lions' run defense is probably for real. I'm not all that concerned about the Falcons going forward personally. We'll see what Ryan thinks in just a second. Week 1, the Falcons carried 25 times for over 5 yards a carry. Week 2, they carried 35 times again for 5 yards a carry. Week 3, only 17 rush attempts for 2.5 yards per carry. That feels like a Lions problem as opposed to a systemic issue with the Falcons. And then I tried to warn you guys this offseason that the pass volume would be low, that we should temper expectations with pass catchers. And I don't know what's a better display of how offensive environment matters for pass catchers than looking at the Vikings and seeing that they've had 11 games from their receivers and tight ends that hit double-digit fantasy points, 11. The Falcons once. That was Drake London in week 2. Kyle Pitts has not hit double digits. Drake London has been below double digits in 2 of 3 games. This is not a passing offense to be excited about, but the run game should rebound against Jacksonville in week 2. Anything else to add in a game where the Falcons were just blown out?
I mean, Atlanta's a good team with a limited quarterback, and to frame that as well as I can for you here, Josh, I would take Josh Dobbs over Desmond Ridder in a one-on-one situation right now.
Yeah, I can't say anything about that. Well, we'll talk about Dobbs shortly, but that checks out with me. Bills Dolphins is our next game. That's going to be a very, very exciting divisional game. Bills favored by 2.5 points. Game totals at 53.5. My first thought was, I don't know if either of these teams should be favored by more than a point, given what we've seen through 3 weeks. I see Ryan starting to think pensively about that one. While he marinates on that, I'll talk about the Bills. Weeks 1 through 2. James Cook only had 2 of the 10 red zone carries, none of the 5 goal line carries. But last week in week 3, James Cook had 3 of the 5 red zone carries, and one of those was at the goal line. James Cook. I am a noted James Cook unenthusiast, but I was enthused to at least see that James Cook was finally allowed to touch the ball near the goal line. In week 3, that is very good for his rest of season outlook when he's been getting the targets, he's been getting the carries, and week 3, we finally start him to get a couple of those high-value carries. What would you like to add about the Bills from what you saw this past week?
Well, first, I'm going to say something about the spread since you mentioned it. I imagine this is going to be an overwhelmingly publicly bet Dolphins underdog team. So I'll probably take Buffalo at -2.5 just for that reason. Might wait a little to see if the line moves, but just as a sports bettor, I'll probably do that. Here's what I'll say from last week. You wouldn't think that Josh Allen played all that well from the box score, but he made a ton of great plays in pressure management. Dawson Knox dropped a deep seam in the end zone. That was a perfectly thrown ball in a tight window. The defense absolutely embarrassed Sam Howell last week. So Buffalo's blown out 2 teams in a row. Now they face Miami, where they can essentially playing for the early lead in the division.
Mm-hmm. Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter, the natural contrarian. I told him earlier that I was having a good day. I think he was having a good day, but then he told me he was having a bad day just so we wouldn't be aligned. Moving on to the Dolphins. We've been saying his name wrong. At first I thought it was Devin. Then I learned it was Devon. Now we're learning it is not A-Chain. It is A-Chan. Devon A-Chan. Doesn't roll off the tongue quite like I would hope. But let's talk about Devon A-Chan. Devon A-Chan. Because I think he's a rest of season fantasy RB2. Their 3rd round pick this year. College sprinter. some very, very exciting usage at Texas A&M in college. A lot of carries, a lot of targets. It's kind of like, oh, this guy's only 190 pounds, but at least he had the workload in college. And you know what? I don't think we could have seen anything more encouraging. I don't even care as much that the guy had over 200 yards. What I care more about is that he had 18 carries and 4 targets. That was really the concern with him. It had nothing to do with, can this guy play football? It was purely, we rarely see someone of this size getting real NFL workloads. 22 touches in his first real NFL game where they're trying to get him involved is unbelievably encouraging. He actually had 6 red zone carries to Raheem Mostert's 2. He had 1 goal line carry. Mostert had 2. Seeing some type of split usage there, I loved it. I think this looks like, we said it last week with Jerome Ford. We were like, is this a max bid fab guy? Week 1, we could argue Puka Nacua probably was. Now that we saw what he did in week 2, it looks like Achane is one of those guys as well. I want to invest in pieces of this Dolphins offense. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, but at times he looked a little bit like if Tyreek Hill were a running back with some of the suddenness, explosion, just raw speed that he was demonstrating.
I don't think I'd quite go that far, but he reminded me a bit of Tariq Cohen coming in, and Tariq Cohen would have never gotten 18 carries in a game. So that was very exciting. And, we discussed this all offseason. Miami's clearly going out of their way to stack speed. They have so many ways they can beat you. They didn't even have Jalen Waddle in this game, which is like mind blowing when you think about it. So Miami, and again, Miami's a solid defensive team too. They can beat you in so many different ways. Can't wait for this game against Buffalo. Wish it was in prime time.
Let's now turn to the Browns and the Ravens. We have a lot of fun divisional matchups this week in week 4. Browns favored by 2 points, thanks to probably their defense. The game total's low at 41.5. If we start with Cleveland, Deshaun Watson had his best game as a Cleveland Brown, bar none. Completed 82% of his passes, 289 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns. The Titans ultimately remain a pass defense to target. I'm not sold that Watson is fully back, but at the very least, it was encouraging to see him dominate in what was a good matchup. Jerome Ford had 10 carries. Pierre Strong had 6. Kareem Hunt had 5. But Jerome Ford ran 21 routes, 6 total routes run by Hunt and Strong. That's good usage. Some are worried because Jerome Ford had under 2 yards per carry. Guys, he played the Titans, pass funnel defense. I'm not concerned. What I liked was that this is a potential workhorse moving forward on a team with a top 3 defense where games are going to be close. And it's very hard to imagine the running backs getting scripted out of any of these Browns games moving forward. I assume Deshaun Watson on tape looked about as good as his stats. Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, I would, even ignoring the box score, what I saw last week was some glimpses that 2020 version of him that we were talking about when we were leaning into him in best ball. Again, I don't think we should be relying on this now, but at least we know that it's there. And most encouraging to me is like he hit a few deep shots that were wide open. That's wonderful. Great. That takes some level of skill. He also made those guys stop and transit a little bit. One of the things that I saw, though, he rolled to his right a few times, a few lasers on crossers. If he can bring some of that to the table going forward, Cleveland's a contender because, like you said, their defense won this game. This is the second game they've won so far this year. Top 5 unit going forward.
Yeah, I have to say it's probably not going to hit because these rarely hit, but I took the Browns to win the 2024 Super Bowl back in February, March, like 30 or 40 to 1. That's looking pretty good right now. This looks like a team where if Watson rebounds, they could be the class of the AFC. Turning to Baltimore, Gus Edwards got concussed. Justice Hill probably maybe returns in week 4. He was out this past week with a toe injury. Deep leagues, you should probably add Melvin Gordon. I know it sounds gross. This is where we are at with the running back landscape. And I told you last week, I'm going to tell you again, because I just keep getting more confident by the week. We can drop Rashad Bateman. Even with Odell Beckham Jr. out, Bateman had 3 targets for the 3rd straight week. He does not look like his old self. The guy has not even turned 24 yet. He's had numerous lower body injuries, and he just is no longer the same player. What did you see out of the Ravens? And I know you were frustrated watching them in this game.
Yeah, they had a ton of relevant injuries, so I don't want to overreact here, but that was a horrible loss to a rebuilding team with a backup quarterback. And, I said we both like Gardner Minshew in that kind of role, but still, like him going into Baltimore and then winning a close game that's bad for the Ravens. And here's the thing here too, going forward. Everyone's been singing the praises of Lamar Jackson. He's always been so efficient. This has been like watching the Giants offense last year, a dink and dunk operation for the most part. Like, sure, he's been real efficient, but does he even have 600 yards passing on the year to this point? So right now, Lamar Jackson's still the best runner in the history of the league. That's his skill. And yeah, he's throwing, dink and dunk passing game. Like, we'll talk about this in a second. You bet on Zay Flowers over receiving yards at 49.5. This man had 8 receptions and hit that number. And that sums up what this offense is doing right now. That said, Josh, I do think this is an investment. How do I frame this? I don't think the Ravens' ceiling on offense is that high right now, but if you can couple Jackson is like an efficient passer in the short game with his downfield ability, couple that with his elite skill as a runner, I think this is a good long investment long term. When this team's playing the Chiefs or the Bills in the playoffs, I think it gives them more outs in those situations. But for now, this is not really a great offense to watch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were talking pre-show, and I said, if you told me that Zay Flowers would catch 8 passes, I would have bet as much money as possible. I would have been taking loans on every credit card and putting the money on Zay Flowers over 49.5 receiving yards. He ended up with 8 catches for 48. Good thing I am a savvy bettor and put 1 unit on that play instead of my life savings. Let's turn to Panthers Vikings. The Panthers are 2.5-point dogs. Game total is 45 points. I think this is the week the Vikings get their first win. If we look at the Panthers, Bryce Young threw for 299 passing yards combined through 2 games. Andy Dalton tossed for over 300 against Seattle in week 3. I don't even think Andy Dalton's necessarily the worst streaming option in week 4, given that he's facing the Vikings. What did you see out of Dalton? And are we allowed to stream him in week 4? Because my fantasy rankings come out tomorrow. And right now I'm looking at him as the most available quarterback streamer for the next week.
We talked about this in the offseason a lot. Andy Dalton was better than people think as a Saint last year. Not blowing the doors off anyone, but can keep you in games. Most of his passing production came late in this one when they were in a negative game script. That said, and I tweeted out this before, let's please send the Red Rifle back home to Cincinnati so that he can keep the Bengals season afloat until Joe Burrow's back to being 100%. That's what I want, Josh.
I think that would be great too. I know you're deathly afraid if Jake Browning has to make a start tonight. Hopefully we don't have to see that.
No, I don't want to see that.
A couple other notes. Chuba Hubbard, after 9 carries in week 1, has had 3 total carries since. We don't love that. And I think Adam Thielen, shout out to our head of DFS, Jordan Vanek, who said, guys, it's disgusting, but I think Adam Thielen might be fantasy relevant this year. I know you and I kind of scoffed, but said, you know what? Like there's probably some weight to that. We trust his research. And once again, Jordan with the outlier call, the only analyst in the industry who didn't absolutely hate Thielen, who now had, after 7 catches in week 2, 11 for 145 yards and a touchdown in week 3, 25% target shares in both games. I think people out there, you lose Mike Williams due to injury. A guy like Adam Thielen might actually be able to get you something going forward, especially with Dalton at quarterback.
In Jordan Vanek, we trust.
Yeah, when he speaks about receivers, you just listen. He was a Tank Dell guy. He was an Adam Thielen guy. He colors outside the lines, and the picture usually looks pretty good when all is said and done. That, folks, is an art metaphor. Now let's move on to the Vikings. I think Kirk Cousins is an every week starter in fantasy, not just an every week starter, like a must start. He's had at least 344 passing yards every game. I think it's both he's played well and this defense is atrocious. This is now also 3 straight weeks where Jordan Addison runs fewer routes than KJ Osborne and has a better box score. Maybe week 4 is when that happens. I will keep saying this, though. Jordan Addison is one of the best buys in all of fantasy this year, given that he's already outproducing Osborne. He's already fantasy relevant, and he's still not even playing over Osborne. Ryan, would you agree with my assessment that Cousins, not just every week fantasy starter, but actually looks like a very good NFL quarterback this year?
Yeah, he's been a good NFL quarterback pretty much his whole career. But what I would say is, I think he's having his best season to date so far. And the truth is, when you look at a pure production standpoint, he's had several borderline MVP seasons to this point. Just not wins and losses, but from production standpoint. And as you know, Josh, because you hate Alexander Madison as a person, as a fantasy option, and you're right about that. The only thing this team really does well is throw the ball, and Kirk Cousins is a big reason why.
Yeah, Alexander Madison had 17 fantasy points. That's probably going to be his high water mark for the season.
Yeah.
The guy this past week faced a Chargers defense that does not care about the running back position. It does not try and stop it. Madison had 20 carries. He had 7 targets. That is the best workload any running back will ever see. 17 fantasy points, stuffed at the goal line over and over again, dropped a goal line target, fumbled at the goal line. I mean, my goodness. This is someone who I think is at risk of ceding significant touches to Cam Akers. We might see them each get 10 cracks on the ground coming up in week 4. Turning to Bears Broncos, we'll just call this game something has to give. The Bears are 3.5-point underdogs. The total's 46. I call it something has to give because I remember watching the Bears down 41-0 pretty early on in the game. I remember the Broncos losing by 50 points to the Dolphins as well this past week. I think with Justin Fields, if he can't perform in week 4 against a Broncos defense that has just been embarrassed the past couple weeks, giving up 35 points to Sam Howell, giving up 7 touchdowns. Sorry, 70 points, 10 touchdowns to the Dolphins without Waddle. I think if Justin Fields can't perform in week 4, he might be droppable in fantasy. Do you think his season is salvageable at this point? Because at this point, I would say everyone that plays fantasy, everyone that watches football seems to be pretty strongly turning against him.
Yeah, I don't think it's all him because when I watch all these games, and this is one of the few offenses where I don't know what the plan is, and it's not because they're not being productive. It's not because things aren't working, but I like, for instance, like DJ Moore is we talked about this before we came on the show. He's a yak player. He's a short area quickness player. I don't really ever see him running drags or anything like that. It's very rare, and I don't know what they're doing or trying to accomplish. But on the other hand, they have no pass rush. As we saw last week, the Chiefs just destroyed them. They could have scored 70 points if they didn't take their foot off the gas. So there is some hope. This happened last year where they struggled in the first month, and then the Bears all of a sudden started scoring 27 points or more for a month plus. So there's some hope here, but it seems like the mood in that organization is not great either right now.
Yeah, we're not going to comment on the defensive coordinator who has apparently some big legal issues. Yeah. He's no longer with the team. Yeah. Ultimately, though, that might actually just be a plus given how poorly this defense has played. Looking at the Broncos, Russell Wilson threw for over 300 yards for the second straight week. Also, more encouraging, he took only 1 sack in week 3 after getting sacked half a dozen times against the Commanders in week 2. The guy I want to talk about, though, is Marvin Mims. Marvin Mims now has 195 receiving yards on 27 routes. That is fewer than a game's worth of routes. 195 receiving yards. Put another way, he's averaging over 7 yards per route run. Anything above 2 is considered excellent in the NFL. He is not above 2, he is above 7. I think he sees more action in week 4. I think it's incompetent if you don't let him run more than 11 routes, which is his season high at this point. And I will be flexing him in a couple leagues as an upside play against Chicago in this matchup. Russ looks good this so far through 3 games, right? It's not just on the stat sheet.
Yeah, he's definitely better than he was last year. I don't think he's all the way there, but in this game, Denver's offense was solid early. Some chuck plays came back negated by fouls, some really tight window throws downfield that he made. The defense, however, was just, I've never seen anything like that. I mean, I don't have the statistic here, but I don't think I've ever seen more 50-yard plays in one game. Robbie Chosen's connecting deep with Mike White at the end of the game, even for like a 50-yard touchdown. Just unbelievably bad defensive performance.
Let's turn to Saints Buccaneers. Saints favored by 3 points. Game total's only 41. We'll start with the Buccaneers. They host the Eagles tonight. Not much to say there. This will be Baker Mayfield's toughest test yet. On the Saints side, Derek Carr has an AC joint sprain. He'll probably miss 2 to 3 weeks. Alvin Kamara is going to return this upcoming week from suspension. Chris Olave and Michael Thomas have 0 combined touchdowns on the season. I think that probably changes in week 4. This will be, I believe, Jameis Winston's second revenge game now against the Bucs. The Bucs got the better of him last time they played. I think they'll probably get the better of him in many ways this week, but I think at least it's encouraging for Olave and Thomas that they're both off to strong starts, and Jameis is going to be chucking the ball pretty deep downfield to both of them. How would you frame Jameis for week 4 against the Buccaneers?
It's a good question, Josh. I mean, I don't have any confidence in Jameis Winston. I know a lot of people were clamoring for him to return, but Andy Dalton was like, listen, if you saw him play the Panthers early last year, it was like a Nathan Peterman level performance, which is brutal. That said, I mean, we do know this is a guy who can throw for 300 yards in an NFL game. They have the weapons, Olave, Thomas, Rashid Shaheed. We're getting Kamara back. It was interesting to see Tony Jones in the Kamara role, seeing like little checkdowns in the flat.
Yes.
With far less fluidity and juice. It's not a knock on Tony Jones, just Alvin Kamara is, one of the better athletes in the position. One thing I want to note here too is Chris Olave rather had a one-handed catch on a deep shot. He made it look easy. One of the better catches you'll see all year.
Yeah, he's looked absolutely fantastic. And I think you might even be able to say that he is a fantasy buy low. I think everyone out there would prefer Amon-Ra to him pretty considerably. I actually think I'd be on the fence as to who I prefer rest of season, but I think it's a very, very consensus take that they're not even close at this point. And I think that's purely because Olave just simply has not scored touchdowns. We look at the next game, Texans versus Steelers. Steelers only favored by 3.5 points. Maybe a little disrespectful. Game total is 41. When we look at the Texans, I want to just talk about Dameon Pierce. He dominated the usage in week 1. But week 2 and week 3, he ran fewer routes than Devin Singletary. The run game has been pretty non-functional given the blocking. Dameon Pierce is going to need the pass down work to be fantasy relevant. So I'm not saying whether or not he's been good or bad on the ground, simply that part of the path to him hitting in fantasy was that he would probably catch more passes than Devin Singletary, who was always a well below average receiving back in Buffalo. Before we talk about the pass game, how has Pierce looked on the ground? Because the box scores have been dreadful, but last year he was one of the NFL's best pure running backs.
Yeah, they're down multiple starters in every game so far this year, so I'd put most of it on the line. He's getting hit at the line a lot, getting hit behind the line a lot. And, he's a guy who moves piles, so I like him as a player. I think he's in a rough situation currently. As far as his passing game work, I mean, I don't really see Devin Singletary as a significant player. I've watched all these games so far. It's not like, they need to get him the ball more. So I could see that being a split, but maybe it's, the poor man's version of Najee Harris and Jalen Waddle, usage-wise.
Yeah. When we look at the pass game, it's much more exciting. Houston receivers. These wide receivers have the 4th most PPR points this year, behind only the Chargers, the Dolphins, the Vikings. I think we all would have known preseason that the Chargers, Dolphins, and Vikings would have a lot of receiver fantasy points. The Texans being 4th on that list. That is very exciting. CJ Stroud still yet to throw an interception. How has he looked? Because for fantasy at this point, I mean, we started him in the league that we co-managed, the two of us, and our waivers and fantasy takeaways guru, Nick Bodiford. And we threw him in this week because we weren't sure if Joe Burrow would start tonight. And Stroud got us over 20 fantasy points. Can't hate that. Good in fantasy, good in real life as well, is my question.
Yeah, through 3 games, they couldn't have asked for more. I'd say Stroud's played well. I'd frame it as more as Houston has a real NFL quarterback for the first time. I don't want to use the word ever, but the word ever might apply here. I compared him to Dak Prescott entering this year. I think that's what I'm seeing too. But as far as his production goes, he had one great deep ball throw to Tank Dell early in the game, drop in, tight window. The other one, which is about 8 points of his fantasy production roughly, Tank Dell long TD on a blown coverage for like 60 yards. If I was going to, this is something that I do for my own stuff. If I was going to project the statistical line using this game, I'd treat it more as 220 in a touchdown versus 280 and 2 touchdowns.
Let's turn to the Steelers. Najee Harris had 19 carries. Jalen Warren only had 8. Ryan hit his prop bet, betting the over on Najee Harris's rushing. The most disgusting play you could make was betting on Najee Harris, and Ryan did it successfully because, in his own words, run fits matter. It was a great matchup. Najee Harris delivered on the ground, but Jalen Warren ran more routes and he only played 5 fewer overall snaps than Najee Harris. Rest of the season, I'm very concerned about Najee Harris because it's not an offense we love, and you really need him to be getting the bulk of the touches there. And then it's sad to say, but I think it's time that we start to consider shopping Pat Freiermuth. His target share has been under 15% each of the 3 games, and his fantasy points have been buoyed because this man has 2 receiving touchdowns on 5 receptions. Especially if you play in a casual league, people just look at fantasy points and they fail to remember that he's not going to catch a touchdown every 2.5 receptions. Anything else to add here for the Steelers, who won, I'd say, relatively convincingly against the Raiders last night?
Yeah, I bet on the Steelers last night. The defense drives this team. Going to be very curious to see what Stroud does against this pass rush. I think we're looking at a different environment this week. Offensive line for Pittsburgh still needs to improve. But we saw that Pickett can be fine. I wouldn't say he was great last night or anything, but he can be fine when he's not playing one of the 5 best defenses in the league. So, a reminder to just not overreact. Matchups matter to a degree, at least.
Mm-hmm. Let's turn to Eagles Commanders. Eagles favored by 7. Game total's 44.5. The Eagles play the Buccaneers tonight in Tampa. I think we would both, for fantasy, be very curious to see what the running back situation looks like. Gainwell is the bell cow in week 1. In week 2, it is DeAndre Swift, who then runs for 175 yards. I think Swift is the lead back in this game and rest of season, assuming he stays healthy. But my confidence is probably 60% there. Anything you're looking for from the Eagles tonight before we turn to the Commanders?
In week 1, they won their game with defense primarily. Week 2, they won that game behind their run game. Want to see if Jalen Hurts lights these guys up a little bit tonight.
Commanders. Sam Howell tossed 4 interceptions. He was sacked 9 times. He has now been sacked 19 times on the year. That is over 15% of his dropbacks. Justin Fields was at 15% last year. For context, essentially every 6 to 7 times that Sam Howell drops back this year, he gets sacked. Those are drive killers, and it has crushed the fantasy production. The pass catchers like Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson. Dotson just on his own hasn't been commanding a whole lot of targets, but even if the Commanders receiver was commanding more targets, it wouldn't really matter because McLaurin hasn't done much either. Again, drive killer when these quarterbacks take sacks. Does Sam Howell look like he's returned to earth? Because this was a player we did not like preseason. Week 2, we actually saw some encouraging flashes. And I think week 3 against the Bills, it was like, yeah, that's Sam Howell.
Yeah, I think the way that I'd frame this is like he's a good backup quarterback, He's going to get creamed by real teams like Buffalo. But if, you face him, you turn him against a cupcake, like we saw Denver just get annihilated by Miami. So that kind of reduces Howell's production in that game a little bit. But, he can perform well in under ideal circumstances. And, this week against the Eagles does not look like ideal circumstances. That said, one thing I want to throw in about the Commanders too, their pass rush has been awesome so far this year. If they played any other quarterback but Josh Allen last week, they would have had a lot of sacks. That dude's just out of control when it comes to making plays, Josh Allen.
Titans Bengals. Titans apparently favored by 1.5 points heading in to week 4. Bengals play tonight, so that's probably partially the short week for them. There's still a little bit of calf uncertainty with Burrow. Game total's really low at 42.5. With the Titans, I didn't really learn much myself from them this past Sunday. I think it just mostly showed that the Browns defense is elite. The one interesting note that I will bring to the table, though, because I can't just say I have nothing, Ryan Tannehill's average throw depth has been at least 8.8 yards in all 3 games, despite Tennessee having maybe the worst offensive line in football. That doesn't really make sense. It's funny. It's the opposite, where Tua Tagovailoa has the fastest time to throw, and he's also throwing really far down the field, where it's kind of like, this is a scheme stat. I don't even know what kind of stat this is for Tannehill, but I think the offense needs to change because it hasn't been effective passing. And when you have a terrible offensive line, you probably shouldn't be taking almost exclusively deep shots. Jordan Love, currently the only other quarterback with at least 8.5 air yards per attempt or better all 3 weeks, like Tannehill. Anything to add here about the Titans in a game where the Browns just stuck it to them?
Bottom line here is it's tough to be competitive when you have the worst offensive line in the league and a bottom 5 secondary. The other thing is I think they should probably consider trading Derrick Henry. He's not his acceleration's not what it was already. And behind this offensive line, it's just they should trade him to a contender if possible.
As we mentioned before, the Bengals play tonight. We think Burrow suits up. If you're listening to this podcast live on Monday afternoon, make sure you go to the33rdteam.com, read Ryan's Rams Bengals game preview. It is free. You can also read his Eagles Buccaneers preview. He discusses how he expects this game to go if Burrow plays and if Burrow doesn't play. Obviously, one of those situations a lot more rosy than the other one. But if Burrow plays in week 4 against the Titans, that feels like the classic rebound spot, right, Ryan?
Yeah, I would say this week against the Rams and then next week against the Titans, if Burrow's fine, he's obviously going to be playing through an injury, but if he's not really limited mobility-wise too much, I could see him stacking 800 yards passing over the next 2 weeks.
Next game is Colts Rams. Colts favored by 8 points, coming off their big victory over the Ravens. Game total for Colts Rams is 45. Looking at the Colts, Zach Moss is a bell cow. 22 touches in week 2, 32 touches in week 3. I would say that Zach Moss is another good start in fantasy once again in week 4. And I would also say that Jonathan Taylor loses leverage every time Zach Moss handles all the touches and remains serviceable. He's actually been relatively elusive by some of the advanced rushing stats. So it's not just that he's getting volume, it's that he's getting volume and performing reasonably well. And then this is a player that I know both of us liked pre-draft. You especially, Josh Downs, slot receiver, now averaging 8 targets per game. He has just ripped away the wide receiver 2 role from Alec Pierce. Talk to me about anything with the Colts and Josh Downs, because I am getting very excited about the hyper-productive college slot receiver who looks like that's translating adequately and then some to the NFL.
Yeah, he was the guy I wanted in the 4th round of rookie drafts just because, I have a thing for short area quickness receivers, but short catch radiuses. That's what he is. You put him in the right environment, he can play well. Here's the thing I'll say about the Colts. Played really well defensively. If Lamar Jackson wasn't the best running quarterback in the history of the league, I think they might have actually shut Baltimore out last week, which is both a good thing for the Colts, who are now 2-1 all of a sudden, and kind of an indictment on the Ravens currently.
When we turn to the Rams, they're going to play tonight in Cincinnati on Monday night. And I actually dropped 2 prop bets for these Monday night games into the free 33rd Team Discord. So if you're listening live, make sure that you hop in there. Any of our articles on the 33rdteam.com will have the link to that Discord. You can see me on Twitter at JLarkyTweets. And I've got a link to our Discord in my Twitter as well. Got one for the Rams-Bengals game. It's an over on a player prop. And then I've got a player prop under in that Eagles-Bucks game. Ryan said, quote, he thinks they're both good bets. So you should probably hop into the Discord to see what those potentially good bets are. I wrote them both up. Anything to add to the Rams before we turn to the next game?
Well, 1, I'm trying to make a bet on the clock on one of your Rams bets right now, pal. 2,
I like it.
One thing I'm looking for next week is the Colts perimeter cornerbacks. Even though their defense played really well this week, they've been torched so far this season. Puka Nacua, Tutu Atwell, Kyron Williams. I don't know how Matthew Stafford's getting premium offense out of these guys, but good passing game matchup for Stafford in this one.
Yeah, I'm going to give a hint. I bet a Stafford over. It's probably not the one that you think, and it felt like a pretty good bet. There's some decent odds disparities looking across books, and I think I found a good one there. Let's turn to Chargers-Raiders, the divisional matchup. Chargers favored by 4.5 points. Game total is 50.5. That is hefty. Mike Williams out for the season, ACL tear. That is painful. Let's turn to targets per route run. We see that Josh Palmer's at 14% on the season. Quentin Johnston is at 21%. I think Palmer is the wide receiver 2 in week 4. That's not what I'm not saying anything differently than that. However, for those saying that Quentin Johnston has literally done nothing and looked terrible, at the very least, this team is consciously making an effort to get him the ball when he's on the field. He's now going to be on the field potentially as an every down player. They took him in round 1 this year. And when you just look at what he looks like, he actually looks a little more like Mike Williams than Josh Palmer does. Quentin Johnston, much more dynamic after the catch, less of a clashing, big-bodied player in some respects, but I loved that in college he had a high depth of target and was also very good after the catch. Very few players like Tyreek Hill are able to actually do that. We'll see if he can do that at the NFL level, but I think he if he were dropped in any leagues. He was dropped in our 33rd team listener league, and I won the bid on him last week. Go me. If you're in my league and you're listening to this, I hope you regret that decision. I spent $12 of $100 on him, and I won him. Now he looks like a potential rest of fantasy starter. And I think this is another one where it's like Jaden Reed and Romeo Doubs. We can think of Josh Palmer as Romeo Doubs, the safe option, probably a little more productive early, but Quentin Johnston, Jaden Reed are the two guys that I would be betting on long-term, especially come the stretch run in the fantasy playoffs. What do you have to say here about a Chargers offense that has looked better by the week?
Yeah, great passing offense. You bet on him to lead the league in passing yards, Herbert. I think they're in real good shape so far with that. Defense actually played really well down the stretch last week against a very talented Vikings passing offense. 2 massive stops late in that game. I do want to say this, though. Back in his first year, when everyone loved Brandon Staley, I was probably the first guy in our space that questioned him. And I get the aggressiveness, I get the macro perspectives, I get that he's a smart guy, but 4th and 1 call from your own 25 up 4, past the 2-minute warning, with your opponent having no timeouts is a little rough for me. But I also understand it because your offense is the strength of the team. That said, the fullback dive play call, though, beside myself when I saw that. Beside myself.
As a Chargers fan, I agree. Beside myself is a more polite thing than what I texted a few of my buddies while watching that game live.
I mean, Keenan Allen had 18 catches in that game. Justin Herbert's one of the best quarterbacks in the league. If Eckler was in, sure, you want to put the ball in his hands, fine. But listen, they literally couldn't cover Keenan Allen.
Yes, they could not. Because we now stream live to YouTube as well, and they penalize curse words. I will not repeat a single text, but I was not happy during that play call. When we look at the Raiders, Josh Jacobs through 3 weeks has 90% of the team's running back carries, 64% of the team's running back targets. That's incredible. But he's averaged just 10 PPR fantasy points a game. My expected fantasy points model that looks at usage has him at 16 per game. This feels like a good bounce back spot against the Chargers. Do you agree there? I mean, we thought it was a great spot against the Steelers. It ended up being fine. The Chargers, is this the explosion game from Josh Jacobs after such a good 2022 season?
Oh, for him, yes. The team, no. I like for the team, I think Vegas is who we thought they were, Josh. They've been blown out too. Not blown out, but they lost decisively last night, despite what the scores said. But yes, if Josh Jacobs is going to get it done, it's going to be this week against the Chargers. And also, Josh, let's throw this in there. Davante Adams was exceptional on Sunday night.
Adams did look like he usually does, despite Jimmy Garoppolo, quarterback. He looks like a potential ageless wonder, where 2, 3, 4 years from now, he might still be a top 3 NFL receiver. Jacoby Myers has at least 10 targets and 81 yards in both games. He has 5 red zone and 3 end zone targets in those 2 games as well. He's a fantasy wide receiver 2 rest of season. I'm going to be very, very aggressive with those Raiders receivers, given that this passing offense, I wouldn't say it's been great, or maybe I wouldn't even really say it's been good, but it's been functional, and it is funneling so heavily through exclusively 2 players, and that's exactly what we want for fantasy. Reminds me like the poor man's version of the Dolphins, where everything goes to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Everything here goes to Davante Adams and Jacoby Myers. Anything to add on the Raiders before we keep moving?
No, I mean, that's just from a spread perspective. 4.5 is a weird number. So that's going to be, I take the Chargers or leave it alone. Might leave it alone right now.
Guys, reminder before we keep going, go to the33rdteam.com. All our content there is free. Ryan's power rankings, Ryan's game-by-game betting previews, his expert picks article. He has so much good stuff on the site. He dropped a new piece this past week as well, where he basically does a quick walkthrough of every game and is essentially like, this is what I'm probably going to bet on. If I were to bet on something, here's what I'm looking for. And if you like fantasy rankings, my fantasy rankings with dozens of player write-ups for context will be on the 33rdteam.com site tomorrow afternoon. You keep hearing how I'm talking about players. I'm like, oh, Jacoby Myers, wide receiver 2, rest of season. When I make these statements, they will be reflected in my rankings. I will never simply talk about a guy as a top 10, top 20 option with nothing behind it. You will always be able to see that the usage we talk about, what Ryan sees on film, it's all reflected in the work that we do. And make sure that you hop in the 33rd team Discord because it is free. And we're in there. Jordan Vanek's in there. Hilo's in there. Ben Wolby's in there. Like Dr. Profit is in there. One of the most famous prop bettors at this point is very active in there. Kev Wheeler, longtime fantasy football contributor. He's in there all the time. We do start sits, trade advice, etc. Prop bets. There's no place like it. And there's also no place like the 49ers versus Cardinals this week in a divisional matchup because the 49ers are favored by 2 touchdowns against a team that just beat the Cowboys. But I think that makes sense. The 49ers have looked like maybe the best team in football through 3 weeks. They have no real flaws. Game total is low at 42. Vegas thinks this will be a shellacking. What do you want to add here to the Niners based on what you saw? Since the only thing I have here is that Elijah Mitchell's 11 carries on a short week for Thursday night is not sustainable. It's why we talked about the usage spike. But what is sustainable is for Thursday night games, you will often see backup running backs getting more carries than usual.
You're going to take some load off the guy, especially when it's Christian McCaffrey. Like you said, best team in the league, can beat you in so many different ways. They get the Cardinals at home off a long week, so the spread has to be 14 points.
It does. When we look at the Cardinals, I made this comparison about a week and a half ago, and I'll keep saying it because it keeps looking more and more true. They're reminding me of the 2021 Detroit Lions. I believe those Lions won 3 games that year. Cardinals might win 3 games this year. Scrappy, feisty team. There's going to be some games that are closer than expected. They're going to have a couple surprising wins like they did against Dallas this past week. Marquise Brown is now averaging 7 targets, 5 catches, 48 yards, and 14 fantasy points a game. And Kyler Murray probably returns in a few weeks. I think he's a good buy candidate. You might be like, Josh, he's had 2 touchdowns in 3 weeks. Yes, but my expected fantasy points model that looks at usage thinks he should have scored 13 fantasy points a game instead of 14. When he's getting some deep shots, when he's getting a lot of targets, you're going to score fantasy points. If you can start him right now with Josh Dobbs, giddy up, because what we saw to begin last year where he was a fantasy wide receiver 1 with Kyler Murray, that is still very much in the cards from everything we've seen so far. What else do you want to add here about what might become America's team by the end of the year with this Cardinals unit?
I probably have more to say about the Cardinals than anyone else. First, I love the Lions parallel. It's very similar. Tough, scrappy team, massive effort where you can literally see it on the field every week. They're going at 110 miles an hour for as long as they can. Josh Dobbs has been really, really good so far. Last week against the Giants, I said the Giants made him look like Tom Brady. He took advantage of some coverage deficiencies in this game. Again, really solid. I'd rather have him than Desmond Ridder. I'd rather have him than Sam Howell. I'd definitely rather have him than Zach Wilson. He's been an excellent addition for them, which will probably cost him Khalil Williams, as Aroni and Kenyon said on Twitter yesterday. I think he's right. There's 2 things here that shocked me in this game, though. The first is the Cardinals' offensive line bullied Dallas, particularly in the run game. They basically won this game. They neutralized their pass rush. Super impressed with that. Even more surprising is the Cardinals' pass rush. Again, it's mostly effort from what I've seen, but they really made a difference in this game too. We'll talk about who they impacted the most in the next game.
Let's talk about Cowboys Patriots. Cowboys favored by a touchdown. Game total is super low at 41. When we look at Dallas, Jake Ferguson's averaging 6 targets a game on only 20 routes. His 30% targets per route run this year, that would have been the highest among all tight ends last year. We really just need him to be a little more involved. I don't think he's done anything for him to be less involved. So I think it'll either stay the same, which, hey, we can't hate 6 targets a game, or it might go up a little bit. And we would enjoy that, since I think Ferguson is a Dalton Schultz type player. He is in an offense that's going to feature him and script some plays for him. And at the tight end position, we often need that. What did you see from Dak and company in week 3? And I want you to pin the loss to the Cardinals on one or two players or units. Who gets the blame here?
I can't wait to do that, Josh. That's wonderful. That just made my day. Before you said I wanted to be contrarian and be in a bad mood, I can't even pretend to be in a bad mood after that. So first, embarrassing loss by the Cowboys. I was fairly heavy on Dallas and Survivor last week. I like them even less now, the Cowboys, since I'm a Giants fan. You can't go in Arizona and lose handily. That said, Cardinals run game bullied Dallas, as we just said. That was surprising. I'm not going to take too much of a beating on the Cowboys defense, though. They lost Trayvon Diggs in the middle of the week. That was a significant blow. You can't really change your game plan on Thursday based off something like that. That's completely unexpected. So I'm going to give them a break, especially since they dominated 2 games in a row. But here's the thing. I've never really been a big Dak Prescott guy because things like this happen with him. Let me ask you a question, Josh. I don't know if the Chiefs play the Cardinals this year, but will the Patrick Mahomes Chiefs go into Arizona and lose to this team?
No, that's not possible. No.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely not. You can blame the coaching staff for putting him in a lot of third downs, and that's fine. Joe Banner said that. Joe Banner's smart. He hired both of us. Definitely respect his opinion. Think he's right with that. But on the other side of the coin here, Daniel Jones went out and beat the Cardinals in the second half last week. Same game, they were down, came back and torched them in the second half. Dak Prescott didn't even come close, and he has a much better supporting cast. I'd put this loss on him.
There it is. Dak Prescott. The loss is on you. Let's turn to the Patriots. Ramondre Stevenson carried 19 times for only 59 yards. Ezekiel Elliott carried 16 times, but for 80 yards. I got lambasted in group chats for taking Ezekiel Elliott over 425 rushing yards for the season. That was not looking great. I will be honest, through 2 weeks, he was not getting a lot of rushing production. Him getting essentially a fifth of that in this game with the 80 yards. I'm feeling much better about the Ezekiel Elliott season long over. And Zeke has now been more efficient on the ground in 2 of 3 games compared to Ramondre Stevenson. One other note is that Kendrick Bourne, I kind of said jokingly, like, and also sort of seriously, like, oh, like Kendrick Bourne, is this really the guy we're going to pick up in fantasy? His career high through 6 seasons was 74 targets. Well, he's led the team in targets now all 3 games. I think he actually looks like he's probably going to be the wide receiver 1 there rest of season. The top option in an offense that's been a little bit more functional than I think we all expected. Deeper leagues where he's still available, worth a flyer. I think I'd put him on the Adam Thielen level, where pretty boring veterans, but I don't think they're going to burn you most weeks when you start them, just given how the teams are using them. Anything else to add here to God, was this the most boring game of the week? This Patriots-Jets one?
If you don't like defense, the answer is yes. And even if you do like defense, the answer might still be yes. Now, let's explore 2 things here, because Bill Belichick's the master of opponent-specific game plans. Guess what Bill Belichick's going to be aware of? That the Cardinals bullied the Cowboys in the trenches. He's going to do the same thing with his running game. He's not going to give Ezekiel Elliott more rushing attempts because this is a revenge game of sorts for him, but Ezekiel Elliott's probably going to be a maximum effort in this game. We'll see what his rushing attempts line comes out at, but I'm interested in that. I was interested in it last week too. And then the other thing is, I'm going to be curious to see who, the quote unquote, the Patriots try to take away from Dallas. I think it might be CeeDee Lamb. I think that would be the approach I'd probably take, but we'll see. I could see this game being closer than the spread indicates.
Let's turn to, we got 2 games left, everyone. Sunday Night Football, Chiefs at Jets. This was a marquee game to both of us heading into the season. Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers. Now it's Mahomes, Zach Wilson. Jets are 9-point underdogs at home. That is essentially what happens when you go from one of the best quarterbacks ever to one of the worst quarterbacks ever in Zach Wilson. Game total is 43. That is being carried by the Chiefs. With the Jets, the first 2 weeks, Breece Hall had fewer snaps, carries, routes run than Dalvin Cook. Week 3 comes along. Breece Hall, everyone was annoyed because Breece Hall didn't get it done in fantasy, but I was encouraged that he had 12 carries to Dalvin Cook's 8, and that Breece Hall ran 11 routes to Dalvin Cook's 6. Significantly more usage for Breece Hall coming off the ACL tear, and it's only week 3. Also, it's not like Dalvin Cook did well. They both ended up with just 18 rushing yards. I'm willing to forgive Breece Hall from last weekend. I am still optimistic rest of season. The only concern with him is still, just like every player on this offense, will be that the floors will always be low when there's Zach Wilson. How bad really is it for the Jets? Because I've told people at this point, I'm not starting Garrett Wilson in any fantasy leagues. And I think there's potentially like 10, 15 backup quarterbacks right now that could come in and put on a better show than what Zach Wilson's giving the people.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's crazy about this is I think if the Jets got their hands on Gardner Minshew, I think they'd at least sniff the playoffs, but now like the defense is good. It's a championship caliber defense. but the offense is genuinely non-functional with Zach Wilson. The idea that they're going to roll with him going forward, like, unless this is the plan is let's make this a lost season. I feel bad for the whole region, honestly.
If we turn to the Chiefs, there's not much to take away here. The best passing offense in NFL history. Sure enough, shredded the worst pass defense maybe this year in the Bears. The one thing I'll note though is I would just leave Jerick McKinnon on waivers. He has 3 carries total on the season. He hasn't had more than 3 targets in any game. Great. He caught 2 of his 3 targets became touchdowns against the Bears. That is not something that I expect to continue. I like that they were just like manufacturing the touches. He got the Travis Kelce type push pass where it often would go to Kelce. McKinnon got that at one point. But guys, it's hard to start someone who's getting 2 to 4 touches per game. So we can just keep him on the waiver wire. Anything to add about the Chiefs destroying in a game we expected them to blow out the Bears in?
2 comments. The first one, I'm going to say something about Sky Moore. When I've talked about Sky Moore, I've never really liked the player, but I want shares of the Chiefs offense, especially given the ambiguous nature of their wide receiver room. I've never really had a good answer to the question, what does he do well? But I saw one route where it was a stop where he broke in. He created a ton of separation on it. I hope they lean into stuff like that, more like Wes Welker, Julian Edelman type routes. I could see that being a path to him being more productive. And here's the thing, guys, this has nothing to do with football really, but we saw that, Kansas City blew out the worst team in the league with Taylor Swift in attendance. And Travis Kelce has taught us a very important lesson. Winners take home run swings. Take that with you, whatever you're doing right now.
I like that. Yeah. I enjoyed the clip where you can see Taylor Swift using inappropriate language to celebrate the Travis Kelce touchdown in front of Travis Kelce's mom, Donna. You have to think dating is going well if she feels that comfortable in that moment. We are happy for both of them. Monday Night Football, we have the Seahawks at the Giants. Giants are 1.5 point underdogs. Vegas thinks it'll be a close one. Game total is 45 though, so there's going to be some scoring, maybe a close game. When we look at Seattle, the first 2 weeks, Kenneth Walker had more than twice as many snaps as Zach Charbonnet, more than 4 times as many carries, 3.5 times as many receptions. And then suddenly it all shifted in week 3. Kenneth Walker had 35 snaps, but Zach Charbonnet had 31. That's almost 50-50. Kenneth Walker did not have 4 times the carries. He just had twice as many carries. And Zach Charbonnet actually ran more routes. He ran 50% more routes than Kenneth Walker. We turn to Next Gen Stats, our friends at Amazon. They actually have Zach Charbonnet averaging 0.87 yards over expected per carry. Walker down at 0.43. Essentially, Charbonnet is averaging twice as many rushing yards over expectation through 3 weeks as Kenneth Walker. I would say Kenneth Walker is looking like an incredible sell high in fantasy because he just scored more than 30 fantasy points. He's facing the Giants. Everyone's going to be excited. But everything that I've looked at analytically is starting to tell me that Zach Charbonnet is coming. Ryan, what's your take on this, having watched the 2 of them these first 3 weeks?
There's one specific play last week where it was a carry off right guard, and I thought to myself, like, who is that? Is that Charbonnet? Or I made sure I looked up his number, and if he plays, I think good things are on the horizon. I think at best we're looking at a 50-50 if they're both healthy, but if people have dropped Charbonnet to this point in your home league, you got to grab him, you got to stash him, because he's one of those guys where if Kenneth Walker goes down specifically, that's a guy you can plug and play every week.
Yeah, one thing I noticed is he almost looks like a tight end with his size at times. The
He's
guy
big.
just has
Yeah,
he's got a big frame. He's got these massive arms. He is a big back. So I know people talk about how he had like the better pass catching resume in college than Kenneth Walker, and people often just assume then that the guy is small. No. Zach Charbonnet looks like a tank.
Yeah.
Turning to the Giants, Daniel Jones has been the most matchup dependent quarterback that I can remember through 3 weeks. He faces Dallas in week 1, 6 fantasy points. Arizona week 2, 32 fantasy points. Niners in week 3, 5 fantasy points. I have been 3 for 3 on recommending whether to start or sit Daniel Jones. We are going to go 4 for 4, hopefully, because I think this is a great spot. I will have Daniel Jones as a top 12 fantasy quarterback. Seattle has allowed at least 323 passing yards in all 3 games. Not that I think Jones is the best quarterback to take advantage of that, but more so the Seahawks defense has underwhelmed massively. When we look at the running backs without Saquon, Matt Breida had 4 times as many snaps as Gary Brightwell. They both only had 4 carries. Again, it was the Niners. Breida ran 4 times as many routes as Gary Brightwell. They both ended up with 3 targets. Maybe a slightly more even split in week 4, but ultimately I'm just not that excited about either of these options moving forward. And then the last thing is that this looks like a get-right game for Darren Waller. He's led the team in targets all 3 weeks. The fantasy production has been a little underwhelming, but Seattle's given up 138 yards per game to the slot. That is where Waller is operating. I am quite optimistic that he can have his first big game of the season in week 4. What else do you want to add here to your Giants team?
Well, first I'll say, expert picks every week. It comes out on Thursday mornings. I predicted the score to this game to be 30-13 49ers last week. I think it was 30-12. So I basically saw what I was expecting. I'm going to throw that game away for the most part. Short week in San Francisco. You're playing the best team in the league on the road across the country on a short week. Not a lot of paths to that going right for you. That said, this week against Seattle, Giants got blown out in Seattle last year. I find the spread very curious because that's begging you to take Seattle, essentially. Seattle's coming cross country. They've been a little Jekyll and Hyde this year. The Giants pass rush, if they play as well as they did last week early in that game, I think they can make an impact here. Seattle has a ton of tools, a ton of ways to beat you in offense. But like you said, I think this could be a Daniel Jones week potentially, especially against the Seattle struggling defense. I'm going to probably play this game in showdown that way, as if the Giants are going to win this game.
Guys, that is Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter. All his work is free on the 33rdteam.com. Power rankings coming out early this week. Matchup previews coming out throughout the week. Picks, predictions will also be out Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and into Sunday. My fantasy rankings hit the site on tomorrow. I was going to say on Tuesday, and then I was like, we might as well say on tomorrow. Ryan and I will actually be back on the airwaves tomorrow as well to break down waiver wire options for you ahead of week 4. From myself, from Ryan Reynolds, from the 33rd team. Thank you, everyone.